Welcome back to Classical Mythology. This is the beginning of Module 10, where we will be looking at least partly the figure of Achilles, but more generally the question of the heroes and what role did they play in ancient myth stories as well as religious practice. Now, in addition to the gods and the goddesses, the heroes feature very prominently in classical myth. The heroes, however, although they are human, they are also more than human. So they are set apart from ordinary human beings, not only by their origin story, but also their actions and accomplishments. There's often a divine aspect to the heroes. There's something that connects them to the gods. So they're a kind of intermediary category of character in the mythological universe. Often their lives are short, but extraordinary. They sort of burn themselves out in their quest for glory, and death and violence are characteristic of how these heroes live their lives, and these things seem to follow them wherever they go. Now we can define particular characteristics of a hero. A hero must be mortal, even though they may have some connection to a deity. They are still able to die, and that's usually a defining part of their story. The hero also performs extraordinary deeds, even if these deeds are morally ambiguous. So just like the gods themselves, the heroes aren't purely good or bad. So this modern usage of hero as somebody we want to admire and emulate, there's an aspect of that to the classical hero, but we shouldn't emphasize that too strongly. In certain cases, we definitely wouldn't want to have the same experiences of a Greek heroic figure. As I mentioned, the hero is also somebody who has died prematurely, often violently or mysteriously. Subsequently, the hero is then worshipped at a grave site, so veneration practice develops connected to the life of this mortal individual. Now, the hero achieves immortality not through being divine, but through being remembered and having stories told about them and songs sung about them in poetry, as well as ritual worship. For example, in the Homeric tradition, the most prized thing that the heroes are after is what is known as kleos in Greek. This means glory or reputation. The thing the Homeric heroes most wish for is to be remembered. And it's that remembrance that preserves their legacy and gives them a kind of immortality after death. In another sense, the heroes have been described as individuals with an overabundance of life force. They sort of live their human experience to the absolute limit, often with very destructive and chaotic effect. Now, how do we know about the heroes? Well, just as in the case of the gods and other myth stories, we have to piece together stories about the heroes, usually from multiple sources. So many different myth traditions may be associated to a particular heroic figure. There's usually not a single life story or biographical narrative. So again, if you're looking for the kind of textbook absolute version of the story of any one of these figures, that's a simplification. Most of these characters had a whole set of traditions associated with them. And often these are regional differences. and some of these differences may be connected to particular forms of worship and ritual veneration from one place to another. So the same episode in the story of various heroes may be told in a variety of ways, and we today must rely both on written and visual evidence in order to reconstruct the basic contours of these stories. On the one hand, we have what we might call vertical traditions. These are variations on the same episode, so the same event is told in a multiplicity of fashions in different types of sources. Or there's what we would call horizontal traditions, where the hero has a kind of ongoing storyline put together from multiple sources. And the hero and the role they play in different types of stories very much depends on genre. So the sort of depiction of a hero you find in a tragedy, for instance, that hero may look very different when they're found in Homer or some other poetic text. So creating a coherent biography of any given hero is a difficult task. But the hero is more than just a story. The hero transcends their story. They are often a kind of archetype. The hero is in constant motion, always immersed in action and exercise of power. They are dynamic figures, always traveling, exploring, fighting, loving, suffering. Again, there's a whole range of positive and negative qualities attached to these heroic figures. Once again, they are neither purely good nor purely evil. Now we'll look at some of the major heroic figures from the classical tradition. Starting with Heracles. Heracles is the son of Zeus and Alcmene, so he's the child of one of Zeus's many infidelities. When we talked about Zeus early on, we noticed that he was kind of prolific in his affairs. As a result, the story of Heracles is very much colored by the anger of Hera, and the wrath of Zeus's wife is central to the telling of Heracles' tale. Now, according to the tradition, Heracles was destined to be a great king, but Hera then intervenes and causes another child to be born. And once Heracles himself is born, Hera's wrath is relentless. For example, a snake is placed in his crib when he's an infant, as well as a series of labors established for him to accomplish a sequence of nearly impossible tasks that he must pass through. So his entire life is spent paying for the indiscretions of his father. In addition, Hera drives Heracles mad, causing him to kill his own family. So there's that morally ambiguous aspect, and the theme of heroic suffering. Not only do these individuals accomplish great deeds, but they suffer unimaginable loss at the same time. And surviving many of these trials, he's eventually transformed into a god and brought to Olympus. So the deification of a hero is not unheard of, even though technically they are mortal or kind of slightly more than mortal. They can be subjected to a divinization process. And that fits very well with their subsequent religious veneration. Ironically, Heracles' name means glory of Hera, even though She causes him an enormous amount of torment throughout his life. His name is in kind of positive reference to her. So Heracles isn't a particularly moral figure. He's often violent, erratic, and even influenced by madness in his behavior. Another important heroic figure from the Greek tradition is Theseus. He's particularly associated with the city of Athens. In some versions, he's the son of Poseidon, but most traditions say that he's the son of Aegeus of Athens. So there's a good example of multiple traditions saying slightly different things about a particular episode in the hero's life. Theseus was conceived while his father was on a journey, and when Theseus grows up, he is sent to his father to have a series of adventures, and these involve overcoming everything from bandits to fantastic beasts. The most famous story is of Theseus and the Minotaur. This is the one kind of iconic tale associated with this particular hero. And according to the tradition, the Athenians are obligated to send, early in their history, the Athenians are obligated to send 7 boys and 7 girls to Crete to be killed by a monster. And this partly reflects what we think the historical political dynamic was very early on in Greek history, where the city-states of Crete exerted a dominant influence in the Aegean and Mediterranean. However, Theseus frees Athens of this obligation. That's one of his great accomplishments. But while he is on the island of Crete, accomplishing his task, he becomes involved with Ariadne, who ends up being left behind as Theseus is traveling home. She is left on the island of Naxos. Theseus's father, while he is away, thinks that his son has died on his adventure and ends up killing himself. So here too, like Heracles, we have the intersection of extraordinary accomplishment as well as immense suffering. Theseus then comes to rule Athens as his father's successor. And Theseus is connected to the emerging Athenian democracy as the alleged founder of a number of important cultural and political practices. But in some ways, he's seen as a wise and moderate alternative to the violent, unpredictable, and chaotic Heracles. And numerous shrines to Theseus were established in the city of Athens and dedicated to him. Now, another figure that some people might not necessarily put into the heroic category, but who is a hero nonetheless, is the ill-fated Oedipus. Oedipus is primarily known from a play by Sophocles called Oedipus the King. And according to the story, the city of Thebes, which is a Greek city, is afflicted with a plague. And this is due to the murder of the former king, King Laius. In order for the plague to be lifted, the murderer must be found and expelled from the city. It's revealed that King Laius and his wife, Queen Jocasta, once received an oracle. The oracle stated that their child would kill his father and marry his mother. Now, in order to avoid this horrific future, the son is exposed in the wilderness and presumed dead. This is a common motif in ancient myth stories. However, a shepherd rescues the son and gives him to the rulers of Corinth to raise as one of their own. Then, Fast forward to Oedipus as an adult. He makes his way to the city of Thebes, where he casts out the Sphinx, who's been tormenting the city. And as a reward for that heroic accomplishment, marries Queen Jocasta. But things still aren't as they should be. The city of Thebes is still under the plague and still suffering. So as the story unfolds, various pieces of the mystery of the murder of King Laius start to fall into place. We learn that King Laius had been killed on the road to Thebes. This causes Oedipus to remember that as he was traveling to Corinth, or as he was traveling from Corinth to Thebes, he killed a stranger on the road. And eventually all the pieces fall into place that in fact the oracle has been fulfilled. Oedipus did in fact kill his father and marry his mother. And this sort of horrific scenario is kind of commonplace in Greek tragedy, but the heroism of Oedipus in particular is related to the degree of his misfortune and suffering. And the theme of the inescapability of fate is very important to this particular story. Another well-known heroic figure is, of course, Achilles. He is prominently featured in epic poetry. He's the son of Thetis, a sea deity, and his destiny is to be greater than Zeus. So there again we have this idea of prophecy at the foundation of some of these heroic narratives. His mother tries to make Achilles immortal by sort of dipping him in a special substance, but his heel remains vulnerable to injury, so that is the motif of the Achilles heel. According to some traditions, Achilles is found among the Amazons, as well as other adventures, but he's most well known from Homer's Iliad, which is focused very specifically on the anger of Achilles. Anger, in fact, is the first word of the poem, which very much foreshadows the theme of the entire work. And the whole storyline of the Iliad revolves around the fact that Achilles was denied a Trojan princess named Briseis as a kind of war prize by the king Agamemnon. He's the leader of the Greek expedition to Troy. In response to this insult, Achilles withdraws from the battle. So, as much as he's a heroic figure and known for his extraordinary strength and prowess on the battlefield, for much of the Iliad we see Achilles sulking in his tent because he was denied a special prize. In his place, Achilles' friend Patroclus, who's also his lover, puts on his armor and fights in his place, only to be killed by the Trojan prince Hector. This causes Achilles to rejoin the battle and kill the great Trojan warrior. Elaborate funeral games are held for Patroclus, where we have Achilles portrayed as showing great mercy to King Priam of Troy by releasing the body of Hector. That's another kind of heroic exploit, is his showing of mercy. So once again, the hero is morally ambiguous. He's not particularly, he's noble, but he's shown as behaving kind of less than noble, but also with a kind of redemptive act of generosity to his enemy. Now, as I mentioned earlier, that's just a few of the major heroic figures from the Greek tradition, uh, but many of them weren't simply characters in stories, but they were objects of ritual religious practice. So heroic shrines populated the Greek landscape. These were called heroa. They were made up of a variety of structures in all kinds of different locations, everything from elaborate temples to simple burial mounds. Some were inside the city boundaries, some outside the city boundaries. Objects could be offered and dedicated to the hero, as well as festivals and games being celebrated in their honor. And hero worship is an important aspect of ancient Greek religion that's not always properly emphasized. In particular, the worship of heroes at specially dedicated shrines. And as I mentioned before, the heroes occupy this middle space. They are more than human, but less than God. So they kind of overlap the two categories of mortal and immortal. Again, this idea of liminality and boundary crossing that we've seen in other mythological contexts. Now, this could simply be an elaborate form of ancestor worship. Many, if not most, ancient societies engage in this kind of practice of the ritual veneration of ancestors, which can take on a fairly elaborate form. Particular heroes are often connected to tribal groups and are the source of a kind of tribal identity. They may be attached to particular cities and be foundational for the self-understanding of the citizens and the formation of civic identity. So they can constitute not only an important part of ancestral religious tradition, but also contribute to civic and political identity. And I think there's an interesting analogy that can be drawn between the way that the heroes are worshipped and venerated and engaged with, and the later Christian veneration of the saints. Those two are heroic figures, simply in a different religious context, but they too are very localized in terms of how they are honored at particular ritual locations. We also find the heroes as an important part of the Greek literary tradition, especially the tradition of epic poetry, Homer in particular. Now, who was Homer exactly is unknown. He is presented as a kind of author or kind of legendary author of important pieces of epic poetry. But it's well understood by scholars today that the Homeric tradition represents a continuity of oral poetry. It was commonplace in the archaic Greek world to have singers of epic songs who would perform on various occasions at royal courts and at festivals by reciting long pieces of epic poetry. You know, we have this image of the blind poet from Ionia. This is part of the tradition of Homer, but he probably is representative of a group or sort of guild of oral poets from early in the Greek tradition. And these individuals are sometimes referred to as rhapsodes or stitchers of songs. So they are capable of reciting, presumably upon request, thousands and thousands of lines of epic poetry. And one of the ways that this was realized by modern scholars is when studies were done of oral traditions in Eastern Europe, where local storytellers some of whom were illiterate, could recite thousands and thousands of lines of epic poetry from memory. And one of the characteristics of the Homeric poems is the formulaic nature of the lines. There's a lot of repetition, and you can sort of see how there's a technique of kind of building the poem as the singer wishes, according to the desires of his audience. Now, the poems that we have, the Iliad and the Odyssey, these are simply, I mean, they're likely representatives of a kind of fossilized performance. Presumably, the story was told slightly differently by different singers on different occasions, but when it came to write the poem down, they took on a kind of fixed form, whereas the oral tradition would have been far more dynamic than that. And from what we know from the textual evidence, the Iliad and the Odyssey are a very small part of a much larger series of epic cycles. So what we have of ancient Greek epic poetry is only a small fraction of what once existed. Most of it has been lost. And even though most people automatically associate the Homeric poems with the Trojan War, this is one of the great sagas of ancient Greek storytelling. The Iliad takes place at the very end of the Trojan War, and the Odyssey afterwards. Odysseus may recount episodes from the war in his travels, but neither of the poems gives a kind of chronicle of the war, as is, I think, often assumed. The story of the Trojan War has to be pieced together from a variety of different sources. And often we only know of the existence of these epic traditions through references in other ancient works. So, another surviving author may record that, make reference to the existence of a epic story about so-and-so that no longer survives. But we have a basic idea of some of the major saga traditions. There's, of course, the creation story. We already looked at that in Hesiod's version, but this was also part of the more epic storytelling tradition. Hesiod also talks about the war with the giants and the titans. These could also be topics of epic storytelling. The whole drama around Thebes, or the Theban saga, this is where this story of Oedipus takes place. This is another trajectory of myth making, as well as the Trojan cycle itself. So there would have been epic poems talking about the abduction of Helen, the Trojan horse story, the fall of Troy, and the homecomings, the return of the heroes from the Trojan War. This is where the Odyssey fits in, as well as some of the aftermath of the Trojan War and the descendants of the participants. So unfortunately, one of the reasons why we have to piece together so many of these myth stories from a variety of sources is simply because most of the material doesn't survive. It's been lost in transmission. So we have to kind of grasp onto different fragments to get a sense of what actually took place. But I would say we are still engaging in this type of epic storytelling in the modern day through the various like superhero mythologies and forms of popular storytelling in film and television. And I think there's an interesting parallel that can be drawn between what we find in Homer, particularly the Odyssey, and a more recent kind of epic myth uh, franchise that is the Game of Thrones series. At least the television show, the novels are still allegedly ongoing. But in the Odyssey, Odysseus is a kind of anti-hero. He prefers to use his intelligence and his cunning and his mind rather than physical force and violence. If he can sort of talk his way out of a situation or think his way to some ingenious solution to a problem, that is what he tends to go for. But in an interesting fashion, the Odyssey explores kind of under the surface of the storyline the aftermath and consequences of war. So any episodes from the Trojan Saga, as I mentioned a minute ago, are told in retrospect in the Odyssey. But the Odyssey also takes an interest in the kind of consequences of the deeds of the heroes. You know, they may accomplish incredible things and undergo enormous suffering, but they also leave behind a great deal of carnage and trauma and damage in their wake. So, what about those other people? And I think a similar thing is happening in the Game of Thrones storyline. If anyone has taken the time to watch that or followed it in recent years, in both the Odyssey and the Game of Thrones narrative, the protagonists are dealing with the aftermath of a large-scale conflict, and that conflict kind of overshadows everything that the characters do. And in both cases, there's issues of rebellion, of civil strife, of usurpation, of regicide, and the killing of kings. And in both narratives, the old order has been swept away, and a new order is trying to establish itself. But what we see in both the Odyssey and Game of Thrones are really the aftershocks of a violent upheaval that are felt by the next generation. In both narratives, most of the uh, heroes have died or have been killed, and then their children and descendants are left to pick up the pieces. And there's a desire to reestablish a kind of equilibrium and bring order out of chaos. So in both instances, the children and widows of the heroes struggle to put the pieces back together. In an interesting episode in the Odyssey, we find Odysseus weeping. He's in disguise, but he's listening to an epic singer, and he weeps as the poet sings of the sacking of Troy. But then Homer compares Odysseus's weeping to a woman as she is dragged away from her dead husband and sold into slavery as a war captive. That is a kind of incredible uh, criticism of the whole ethos of battle that is kind of a hallmark of Greek heroic tradition, uh, kind of putting a spotlight on the experience of a victim of those uh, of the waging of war. Later on in the poem, when the suitors are slain and a servant rejoices, Odysseus actually rebukes her, saying, it is not pity to glory so over slain men. So here too is this idea of Odysseus as anti-hero. He's not particularly proud of his use of violence. It is a necessary tool sometimes, but it's not something to be celebrated. And I think we see a similar sort of dynamic in the Game of Thrones story, which is dominated by people without reputation. They don't yet have a heroic legacy, and the very ideals of heroism and warfare are sometimes seen as pointless. In a particular episode in season 6 of the television series, Jon Snow says to Sansa Stark, "We should have never left home." In spite of all the things they're accomplishing and engaged with, what is the point of all this so-called heroism? So that's just another example of a modern reworking of mythological themes, but I think one that has a kind of interesting take on heroism, but one that isn't unfamiliar to the context of ancient literary tradition. So these sorts of explorations of war and violence and the notion of the hero are not monolithic. Epic myth often glorifies war and conquest and immortalizes the conquerors, but sometimes they can be subversive as well and question the very nature of that kind of activity. That is, if we read or view closely. So we'll continue on the theme of the heroic in the next segment.